Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the What If session on what if drugs are printed from the internet. I'm Mark Henderson. I'm Head of Communications at the Wellcome Trust, which is the world's second largest charitable foundation devoted to improving health through science and research. This is a really interesting emerging area that's very much the result of a confluence of a number of different technologies. We have advances in synthetic biology allowing us to make all kinds of biological materials in new ways, creating opiates from yeast, fuel from E. coli or algae. And these developments in synthetic biology are allying at the moment with developments in manufacturing, and particularly 3D printing. As a result of this, as these different technologies, biology and engineering, come together, new possibilities are emerging. And one of those is the 3D printing of drugs. Last year, we had the first FDA approval in the US of a 3D printed drug. This is a drug called Sproxil, which is for epileptic seizures, and it does carry potentially large benefits. In this case, for example, the doses don't have to be mass-produced in the same way as traditionally has always been the case, with the result that it may be possible to personalize, to make one tablet for me with a particular dose and another tablet of the same drug for somebody else with a different dose. There's a potential advantage in terms of convenience. It could be that it's your neighborhood pharmacy to begin with that has the necessary technology to print drugs from scratch. But before long, it may be possible to have that same technology in the home. And finally, of course, this carries risks with it. To what extent could this technology be used for drugs that have an adverse safety profile or illegal drugs? What are the implications potentially for bioterror? What are the implications for access and issues like drug resistance, if it was possible to distribute antibiotics in this way, for example? To discuss these issues, we've got a great panel who've come together to take you through. To my immediate left, we have Nita Farahany, who's a professor of law and philosophy at Duke University. We have Sang-Yup Lee, who's a chemical engineer from the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. And we have Ashifi Gogo, who's the CEO of a company called Sproxil, which he described to me earlier as brand assurance, a company that deals with counterfeiting and other similar issues. We've also had some poll questions that we're going to ask you for an opinion on, and also go through some answers from that have been put out there on social media. So the first question, would you feel comfortable taking medicine from a digital prescription sent to a 3D printer in your home? Put your hand up for yes, please. And no. So a lot more yeses than nos. And can we show what the social media result was? So pretty similar, I would say. Perhaps even a bit more pro in the room than on social media. The second question, do you think more people would take illegal drugs if it was possible to make them at home? Yes. No? There's a couple of no's. And what did social think? Interesting. A lot more thought no on social. And then the final setup question, would you trust your neighbor to use a new device that could convert bacteria to fuel in their garage? I guess that's with or without a 3D printer. Yes?
Not many.
No, but there are more hands going up. Okay, and no? Certainly a majority for no here. And social media? A trusting crowd, clearly.
Good neighbor.
And so, I think that's probably enough to set up the discussion to begin with. I'm going to ask Sang-Yup to kick us off with just a couple of minutes on the technology. Where are we now with 3D printing of biologicals in this way?
So let me first divide it into real chemistry-based and also the other on bio-based. So chemistry-based, as you know, this 3D printing is, in fact, it is additive manufacturing, as you know. However, when chemistry involves, obviously some kind of chemical reaction should happen to make a certain new compounds, which can be used for either drugs or something else. So what you need to do is that you have 3D printing setting, but the ink used will be different precursors towards the synthesis of the drug you want to synthesize. And the protocols are available, and of course the reaction condition can be controlled under the reaction where we call, and then you can design, and then you download the protocol for certain chemical synthesis. Now you purchase precursor A, B, and C. Now you make your drug D. So this is the possible way of doing it. I should also mention that not all the chemistries yet possible because some involves enantiomer selective or residual selective conversion. However, we are of course improving it. Bio-based part, which I am majoring in, you can make basically anything. I'm sorry to say that. You can make not only chemicals, fuels, and materials, but drugs as well. And one particular example reported last year in Science by my colleague at Caltech was using yeast and introducing 21 heterologous genes into one yeast strain to make opiates. And obviously opiate represented by morphine, and obviously she couldn't publish a morphine story because it's too dangerous, so she focused on one of the medicine. But let's assume the situation that you can actually synthesize, biosynthesize morphine and other natural compounds through engineered microorganisms. Well, now you can brew all those drugs in your kitchen, so that's fine. What if you merge those two? Even more powerful technology. Why? Let's take an example I already said. So you brew yeast to make morphine. Now, if you put it in your 3D printer to diacetylate it, then you get heroin, which is most potent. The name heroin obviously is the king of the drug. That's why it's called heroin. It can be taken anyway, transfer easily, etc. So that's very illegal. So that's the point probably we can get back later on, right?
And I guess within that, does that mean what you're saying is that it may be possible to, as it were, download the morphine recipe?
Absolutely.
But you could hack that?
Well, I wouldn't say hack it, but yes, if you can use the analogy for hacking, yes, you can hack someone else's home, for example. So he wants to print, for example, painkiller. Now you hack that house because you hate that guy. Now he's making morphine instead and take a lot of morphines instead of painkiller. Well, morphine is painkiller anyway, right?
Sure.
But different form of chemical.
Brilliant. Nita, obviously this does raise significant ethical issues. How would you characterize those?
So I'll start it with an analogy, right? It used to be that if you wanted to hear your favorite musician, you would need to go and listen to that musician play live. And then you got to the point where you could actually buy a recording of that musician by going into the store, and now you could download it in your home. And when you could download music in your home, it became incredibly socially disruptive for the entire industry. There had to be a rethinking of how to do things. Our traditional way of distributing drugs in the United States, around the world, has been through prescriptions by physicians, through people regulating both the materials that were going into it, as well as regulating the delivery, as well as the prescriptions. And all of that is about to change, because now with the digitization of information, when it comes to drugs, the ability soon to be able to print these things in your very own home, the ability to regulate is totally changed. But we're seeing this in a lot of different areas. We're seeing the personalization of medicine, the ability of people to do things themselves is no longer going through physicians, is no longer going through traditional modes. So we have to rethink the way we do things. If we want to protect individuals from, for example, the hacking of their homes so that they're printing out morphine pills, or you want to make sure that the quality of the drug that you're taking or the dosage that the drug you're taking is actually correct, that's very difficult to regulate or oversee when it's individuals who are actually printing it at home. And if you want to regulate the kinds of materials that people have access to, that used to be easy because you wouldn't sell them the materials. And now if you can actually create the materials at home, and we're not quite there yet because of some of the limitations of the technology today, but we will get there, we're going to have to rethink the way we do things. So I think what we're facing is a complete disruption of the model of drug delivery to individuals. And so the ability to run a kind of paternalistic model of protecting individuals is over. And so how do we get to a new place where people can confidently take medicines, where we can regulate certain socially harmful kinds of drugs, and ensure that we actually have the balance that we're looking for between individual freedom and access to these types of drugs versus the socially disruptive effects of being able to print them at home. So it opens up a can of worms, is the short answer.
Are there any particular principles that can kind of help us to make sense of that?
Well, we can look at analogies, right? I mean, this
Yeah.
is not the first time that we have faced social disruption to an industry. If you look at synthetic biology, which is something that we've already talked about, this is an area that we're already trying to figure out how do you deal with the fact that a lot of synthetic biology is happening in garages. So the question that you all asked on social media is a really good one to ask, which is how do you feel about your neighbor actually doing complex types of biological things in their garage where it could have implications for the environment and implications for the world. And each of those different technological advances we can approach from ethical frameworks, from legal frameworks that we already have. It isn't as if there aren't existing legal frameworks and existing ethical frameworks to help us address these issues. But there are some novelties that are posed by 3D printing, and those novelties are ones that require that we actually think about adaptive regulation, think about kind of how we're going to balance individual freedom and autonomy against the societal dangers of being able to print drugs and other things at home.
Great, great. Now, Ashifi, you deal with counterfeiting, among other things, in your work. Can you describe to us why you think that's relevant to this debate?
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you look at the discussion, we're focusing on the 3D printer with all the ingredients already available and ready to print the drug. But there's a very intricate supply chain that precedes the actual process of printing a drug in your home. Even today, with the large pharmaceutical companies that are heavily inspected by regulators, drugs that end up being made can be sourced from a wide array of suppliers, in some cases passing through 24 hands or different companies before they end up at the pharmaceutical company. At the pharmaceutical company, they'll have to do chemical tests to make sure that what they've received, the batches that they think are the right ingredients, are actually so and are good for manufacturing. All of this, we're talking about condensing into a machine potentially the size of a coffee maker in your kitchen, which has a lot of engineering challenges, but also a lot of trust-related concerns. It may seem like doom and gloom, but if you take a look at coffee as an analogy, humans have been drinking coffee for a couple hundred years. You can make coffee at home, but we still queue up at Starbucks to get our coffee. And so there's an element of human behavior that doesn't necessarily guarantee that 3D printed drugs will be taken up in large volumes.
And what about the intellectual property aspects of this? Because, I mean, we see already on a macro scale, on a large scale, it's very easy to produce generic copies of commercially available patented medicines. I mean, if you had this technology, surely it would become much more possible to do that on a small scale as well, that could operate sort of out with of the kind of legal structures that we have available there.
That's right, and I think the manufacturers of these printers will probably have some disclosures related to intellectual property. and then the risk that the individual that prints a drug bears on distribution as well. Different states, at least from a US perspective, have different rules on how drugs get distributed. And so you're talking about changing a legal system to enable the risk associated with a neighbor printing a drug and distributing to other neighbors as an informal pharmacy being contained so that the appropriate measures could be in place to avoid such situations.
But in essence, this could make everybody a generic manufacturer of drugs.
It could also make everyone a generic drug dealer. So it could go either way. Yeah.
Generic
Nita,
drug dealer or good drug dealer, or it's just based on what you're making, right?
That's
Yeah.
right.
Nita, how would that work legally?
Well, the questions about intellectual property are complex, and part of the reason why I started with the analogy to the music industry is that's one of the areas that we've seen digitization of information, which really disrupted and required that the industry rethink how they thought about it and how they operated with respect to intellectual property. And the same thing is going to happen and is already starting to happen because of 3D printing. So whether it's somebody violating a patent by printing a drug at home or printing an object or a spare part at home or the many things you could do with 3D printing, or even the information itself, violating copyrights, violating trade secrets, all of these things are possible with new 3D printing. And I think what that is going to require is that you can't hold on to traditional models of intellectual property within this area anymore. And instead, you have to rethink what intellectual property looks like. It will require a reorganization of the industry, much like that has happened within the music industry. And that may be things like trying to have licenses that work for the people who are distributing the prescriptions, the recipes that people are able to download. It may require a very different economic model for recovery for drug development because the drug manufacturing may be much more localized. But that has a lot of promises for a new economic model, given that the cost of distribution will change a lot, and the ability of people to be able to create dose-specific and dissolvable tablets in their home enables kind of new possibilities to rethink what the industry looks like. But it's going to change and challenge traditional intellectual property, and I think that's a good thing. It's time for there to be some innovation within the industry and a rethinking of how they recoup their drug development costs.
And one of the interesting aspects about personalization in general, and this isn't true only of this area, but is of the potential tension between thinking about precision, personalized medicine and public health in a bigger, broader community-based way, and actually, will it be possible to deliver that real personalized care at a cost point that's going to be relevant to the majority of people? Is this
it
a
may
technology?
be more possible in this context, right? I mean, so personalized medicine, when it comes to genomics, is an economically problematic proposition right now, and it doesn't work out in the economics, even though it works out in the sort of theoretical concept of personalized medicine, because the ability to develop targeted, specific therapeutics for very small, essentially consumer bases doesn't make sense from the drug development perspective. But if you could vary dosing, and if you could take very precisely into account the size of a person, their reaction to particular types of chemicals, so that they could, on a dose-specific or amount-specific basis, print at home something customized for them, that isn't a burden that's being placed on the manufacturer anymore. It's something that could be enabled through 3D printing. So I think it enables personalization of medicine in this context, given that what you're talking about is a compound that works for millions of people, but the specifics for an individual can be tinkered with on an individual basis. So it's very promising, I think, in terms of personalized therapeutics that way.
Sang-Yup, it sounds like from the economic point of view, from the legal and ethical point of view, this is a doable thing. This is something that can happen. Right. Should it happen? Is this something you want to press ahead with?
Right. I think it's probably too early to state this because we have still some more time to go for this session. But I'm quite, even though I'm a tech-oriented person, I actually make things, 3D printed chemicals or bioengineering to produce whatever you want. But I'm actually negative, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But I'm not against the technology. Technology should be advanced because there are definitely benefits. So let me first start with an example of personalized medicine case. So it's going to be, no matter what you do, it's going to be expensive. No matter how technology advances, there's one person coming in, there's a newborn baby, he or she needs to be resequenced. It's for every individual. So what I suggest to a big pharma for personalized medicine actually is you want to benefit people by doing so. So one way of doing it is you want to sort of narrow down the classification case. So instead of just buying just general cold medicine, you can select from number 1 to 100 different type of cold medicine, and you know that you need to buy number 76 to best to treat you. So that kind of things will happen based on advances in personalized medicine, still keeping the cost down. If you want to have your own drug prescribed based on your own information, it should be expensive and you have to pay, because that's what you want it for. Now, let's look at the general view of these, do-it-yourself type drug manufacturing and consumption. I mean, there are some obvious advantages. For example, let's assume that I have a baby who is 3 years old, and suddenly at the 2 a.m. at night, he is sick. Now, through the 3D printing facility at home, what you can do is you just look for the whatever FDA guideline for treating this symptom. You print, now your baby is cured. Or you are living in an island, very remote island where drugs are not available. But this kind of situation can happen. Now you can make it at your home, or your neighbor can make it for you, because it's an urgent situation. But if you generalize it, now we are in problem, because as you know, even the sleep aid pill, yes, when you have problems sleeping, you should buy and have it, right? But there are some people who I don't understand, who buy about 200 pills and eat them all and commit suicide. Now, if you can print them at home, you don't have to even go register buying 200 pills. You can print 200 pills and eat them all, and you die. Of course, I understand that this is very extreme case, but always the healthcare-related issue considers such extreme cases as well, because of safety and the security at the prime objectives.
Sure. I think, can I add to that? Because a maybe less extreme example than suicide is we rely right now on physicians or on the pharmacists to look at the contraindications between drugs that you're taking and your pre-existing conditions, or to say, look, I see that you're being prescribed this sleeping pill, but I also see that you're on this anti-anxiety medication, and if you take the two of them together, they actually have a particularly dangerous result. So either you shouldn't take your anti-anxiety medication, or you should have a different prescription, and I can ask your physician about that. When people are they don't have that kind of knowledge. I mean, that's part of the reason why we trust physicians and we have specialists. When they now can print them at home, it may be more difficult for them to be able to figure out those contraindications, since we have some serious kind of safety concerns to worry about. And so it isn't the person who intentionally commits suicide now, it's the many more cases of adverse reactions and interactions at home that we worry about. And I think that's what makes this different than downloading your music and different than a lot of other industries is the risk to health and the very significant specialization of knowledge and information in this space that makes people a lot more frightened about it. And it makes it different than a lot of the other do-it-yourself kinds of consumer-based healthcare things that are out there, is that it truly is very specialized chemistry and very specialized information that is difficult for the average consumer to be able to test and say, do I have the right compounds? Is this what I expect it to be? Is it reacting the way that it's supposed to? Can I take it with the pre-existing medication that I have? Is it okay to take it after drinking a glass of grapefruit juice? All of those things that we get as services that are bundled with drugs right now suddenly become unbundled, and we don't know how to address those issues.
I guess related to that, there's that whole issue of how would this work in practice? Would you have effectively a reservoir of the different reagents you need in your home, sort of packed into the printer, ready to go in case you needed this drug or that, or
it depends in part on what we're doing. I mean, so there's materials creation, which we're not at yet for 3D printing, right? So, and so you're sourcing materials versus 3D printing of you source materials and it's able to do additive manufacturing, as he was talking about. We're not yet creating the chemicals at home. That's when you can start printing the illegal compounds and start creating the tailored and unique and being your own drug distributor at home.
So you still have to order the raw material.
Right now you still have to order the raw. I mean, in fact, the FDA printed drug, you actually have to order the drug,
Right.
and it simply turns it into a dissolvable tablet. And so it's not as if it is true 3D printing in the way that I think our imagination really thinks about 3D printing, which is creating from scratch some object simply from the digitization of information.
But I do think from a technology perspective, the contraindication and basically the work of a doctor through programs like IBM's Watson are being digitized, right? So I'm not as worried about whether you're going to be taking drugs you're not supposed to take, as long as you're able to feed the system with the right sensors, the appropriate information, you'll get the appropriate guidelines on what to do and what not to do. Question is, if you decide to override the information, there's less of a personal touch. When you go to a doctor who seems knowledgeable and she tells you, don't take this, this is a little more powerful than a little pop-up window coming on your thing that says, okay, you just dismiss. You probably just keep clicking okay, don't even read it. You may just find yourself in a bad position. Now, I do think that there is a compromise that can be reached for this type of new drug production, which is perhaps more decentralized. And if you look at some products that have very challenging supply chain needs, like cold chain products like vaccines and so on, imagine you could ship these in more stable formats and then have them 3D printed locally on the island that has transportation issues, for instance, and then administered as needed so that there are no big bulky storage areas. So if you perhaps look in on the fringes of supply chain needs, there might be more specialized applications that could champion this cause.
I can raise one more issue that we should worry about. For example, if you look at the raw materials for the synthesis of drugs, and let's assume that everybody now have 3D printer for drug printing, then they have to buy all the necessary raw materials a priori, which means that that's way a lot of more raw materials than what actually human beings need. So it's waste, and it has expiration date.
Yeah.
So you have to throw away all these raw materials. And who's going to take care of all these waste materials, which can be potentially toxic to the environment back to humans? So that's one major issue. Also, I have a question for you. When you buy $1,000 smartphone, brand new one, either Apple or Samsung or whatever, do you read manual? No, so that's the problem. So even though there's IBM Watson doctor telling you what to do, what to not do, they don't read. So
you have to have it not print, right? So, I mean, it's not just a pop-up window. It says, no, you're taking this other drug.
Exactly.
Will
So
not
the
print,
machine
right?
should have such a regulation, which is automatically done.
Right.
So
I'm surprised it's that low.
So I guess as a result of that, you've got, I mean, maybe in the longer run, there's this possibility for the at-home printer, but in the shorter run, these are more likely to be things you would access via your local pharmacy or the vaccine distributor, as Ashifi was suggesting. Or I suppose then, in the longer run, could you have a dual key kind of technology where you can only activate your printer when it gets a code sent by your physician?
One interesting thing to overcome such a problem is actually you go in between always. You don't have to go the other extreme, right? So one possibility is if you talk about the, say, grid technology for local energy manufacturing. What you can do is instead of just going to the drugstore all the time, you have the collection of people who share all these raw materials, maybe under the head of village or something, and then you can make your own drug if you need, based on the need. So then you decentralize it, but still you have this local attraction of printing whenever you need.
Sure.
But if you do look at technologies that are meant to enable consumers to make things from home. Look at a color printer, for instance, or compact disc technology. You can make your own music, record it, and give it to people. They all end up being circumvented in some way or other. You could buy a color printer cartridge that's not from the manufacturer, including the chip and everything, all these protections, and still bypassed. And so there's a real concern around the use of these raw ingredients because human ingenuity is quite crafty, and it's not really clear that there's too many precedents on how to secure these raw ingredients.
So I agree with that wholeheartedly, and so we're giving sort of the cautionary tale, and I want to take a slightly different approach to say, it's almost here, right? I mean, we already have the ability to print certain kinds of drugs. At least you get the drug and you're able to make it into the dissolvable tablet. There's already the possibility of the chemistry-based 3D printers, which enable you to print raw materials. And of course, the bio-based ones are far more advanced already in your ability to create novel materials. And so then the question is, so then what? Because it's going to happen. Humans will circumvent every possible kind of stopgap measure that you put in to prevent people from doing so. And so given that, what are we going to do? Because people will be able to print 3D drugs at home in our lifetime. And I think we have to recognize that that's the case. And so we have to come up with a very different system of quality checking and a very different system of educating individual consumers who are going to have the capacity to be able to print drugs at home. And that's where we are today, is trying to figure out, given that people are going to have this capacity in pretty short order, how do we make sure that people can do so safely in ways that won't harm them? And I think most people, except for the novelty perspective in the beginning, if it's an essential drug, you're going to want to go to your pharmacist and get it. And so a lot of the applications in the beginning might actually be the more illicit applications rather than the standard type form ones, because people who want to get their heart medication will go get it from the pharmacist and the ordinary manufacturer. And so illicit drug printing probably will happen faster at home and sooner than home than non-illicit drug printing. And we've got to address it. And we need to address it now, really.
Great. Good point to turn over to questions. I can see several. Have we got microphones coming?
Lots of questions.
Yeah.
Great. Do you want to start down at the front, and then we'll work back? I'll take 2 or 3, and then we can come back to the panel.
I mean, I could actually see where having a primary care physician, just kind of keeping it at the pharmacy or primary care physician, that's going to be a big enough shift already. But in the current drug discovery process, they design to manufacture in a way. And so can you talk to maybe how this would change maybe even the drug discovery process? Because now all of a sudden that constraint of manufacture, you'd have different constraints probably, but what do you see? Could that make it better or worse?
Let's take one more question behind you, and then...
It's not almost about to happen, it's already happening in China.
Right.
China produces more PhD level synthetic chemists than most countries produce hairdressers. And not all of them have jobs. So if I have cancer and I go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, there's this experimental drug, but I can't give it to you. They go onto Taobao, they find a synthetic chemist who'll make that drug for them. Done. But of course, it's not controlled. You don't know about the purity. You don't know about any of these things. And it's not sure who's committed a crime. But it's really dangerous.
Yep.
But if we make that the doctor's not allowed to tell them about the experimental drug, that doesn't help either. Because open access, which Mark believes in and I believe in, will then give them access to all of this trial information. They find the compound, they go onto Taobao, and then...
Absolutely.
So it's already happening, and it's terrifying.
I agree. So
let's take one more, and then we'll...
Just going back, I think
back.
there is one thing, coming back to Professor Lee, no, this thing is not about just drugs. I think it's the whole, we still need doctors to advise people. So, whatever system that discounts, this is only one dimension of the system. And, the way the doctor supervises and the pharmacist is also there to advise, I think we shouldn't forget those roles of these people. And they could be the gatekeepers, depending on which model you go, because also technology is advancing so much that you can have facial recognition to say, okay, this is actually the patient, and even what medicine that comes is actually those, and the interactions with all this AI that we have now will be easily determined that this drug is not going to conflict with the other. So I think that dimension is something to consider.
Oh, good. I'm glad we took those 2 questions, actually, because they kind of... There's a tension between them. The doctor, pharmacist as gatekeeper, and on the other hand, all these synthetic chemists wandering around, willing to make you anything. How do we resolve that?
Well, I can start with the question. Let me start with the second question. Yes, it is true. Let's assume that your beloved is having terminal cancer, ready to die. And if you are aware of this chemical, synthesized by nobody, and claimed to cure the terminal cancer, what are you going to do? I'll take it. I'll take it. Frankly speaking, yes. Illegal, I don't care. Illegal, I'm going to go to jail. But I'm going to make my beloved alive, right? So it's happening in the world. But in general, if you expand it to the general, oops, it's going to be really dangerous. So we got to do something about it. About the gatekeeper issue, yes. That's why I said in general, I'm against 3D printing yet, at least for now, because safety and security are the first utmost importance of human healthcare. It's going to spread. Let's assume that you are printing antibiotics. You don't know how long you should take. So you take 2 days, you feel good, okay, I don't take anymore. Now you're happy bugs are developing resistance. And unfortunately, it's spread it. That's the problem, killing other people. It saved you by 3D printing, but it killed other people. So there are a lot of problems we can expect, so you should be very careful. Regarding drug discovery, yes, I can do it on me, but not for others, because it's unsafe. How can you do it on myself? Let's assume let's take this Oriental resin. I don't know if there are many Chinese, but Chinese, Korea all share this traditional Oriental medicine concept. That is traditionally based on multi-target, multi-compound therapy. Instead of US FDA approving single target, single compound mechanism-based action. Why? Human body is so complex. Are you sure that you can cure that disease with a single compound? No. So Oriental concept is totally different. You mix up different plants, you boil them together, you squeeze soup out of it, you drink this black soup for a month. The problem, half of that might be toxin, killing you. But you're cured by trial and error approach over the 5,000 old year history. So can you isolate only those functional compounds and make those multi-compound work on multiple targets at the same time? That's going to be best drug. Now, here's good thing. I said about do-it-yourself type drug making here, right? What we have been doing all over the years is do-it-yourself food. Now in Korea, we have a saying called 식약 동원. Nobody understands. Shik means food, 약 is drug. Dong is same, one is origin. So food and drug has same origin. What you eat can cure disease. So best way to prevent disease is eat well. That's where nutrition come into play when human healthcare system is coming. So all those things merge. Now, if you want to do it yourself type 3D printing, I strongly recommend do make good food for your dinner.
Just
Ashifi, yeah.
Yeah, really quickly on the discovery point. There's some parallels with the SETI at Home project. If you may remember, there's all these computers sitting idle that were harnessed to process some data. So this may actually help address the waste situation. Is if you have all these 3D printers humming away, printing these drugs and experimenting on them and providing the results back to a research center, that could be a way to decentralize these experiments in perhaps a controlled way to accelerate the development.
I'm just going to chime in one piece. So on the it's already happening, the examples that you give point out the dangers of trying to regulate and restrict, given that it's already happening, because the people who then access the technology and use the technology are the most desperate. They're the people who are the most likely to end up with the bad results as a result. And so when we try to restrict technologies and when we try to restrict information-based technologies like this one, I think it's a really dangerous proposition. And it's a losing proposition because it's already happening. And if it's already happening, there's no oversight of it. There's no kind of market to develop the secondary testing kinds of machines and equipment that would come out in a more transparent environment. And so I would love to take the position of we're not ready for it yet, it's not safe enough yet, and therefore we should oppose it. I don't think we have the luxury of that position anymore. I think instead we have to embrace the fact that 3D printing is happening. 3D printing of drugs is happening. The digitization of information and prescriptions is here. And in light of that, a model that really uncomfortably embraces that and says, given that, how do we develop robust mechanisms for safety and efficacy testing? How do we develop mechanisms to check the information that people are downloading and have something like a verified prescription versus an unverified prescription? Secondary kinds of tools that you could have at home to test the compounds, to verify the compounds, something that you could, kind of put your pill that's printed out in and have it do a spectrometer kind of analysis and say like, yep, you did it right, it's a good one, you can take it. We still, of course, need physicians and pharmacists. There's an essential role because you want the person to tell you this is what you need, this is the prescription you can download. But if the distribution is going to be local, we need to enable it and embrace it so that we have the secondary market that can enable the safety and the efficacy testing of it that would come along with an open market.
More questions. Let's go this side. I can see somebody in the second row there.
Hi, so I'm an analytical chemist and I worked in pharma and I now work in the diagnostic industry. And so all the things you've been saying, I hear completely. Your point right there, I think you probably just explained why it'll never happen if we need to go the way. Because if you need to buy the printer and you need to buy the reagents and you need to buy a spectrophotometer and you need to download the thing, by the time you've done that, the cost of those few pills that you're going to print is going to be so ridiculously high that it's actually going to, for the good people, the people who actually want to use it correctly, are not going to go down that road.
Right.
How about looking at it the other way, which is to say that coming from pharma, a huge amount of our problems were just trying to get the right number of pills to the right place at the right time. So you still have a logistical nightmare, but if you could personalize it so the prescription goes to the pharmaceutical company, they print out your one directly with everything under FDA, they've got all of the lot checking and so forth, and then they ship it direct to you at home, which we're sort of going to anyway with the centralized drug systems in the US. That might be a way you can keep things a little more under control, but bring the price of drugs down.
I think that's true today, right? I mean, I think you're right, and the reason I give the examples of all the additional things you would need for safety testing is those are the benefits that you're getting through going with a centralized distributor or a centralized manufacturer. The cost of all of those goods will come down. They'll be integrated into a simple machine. We'll get to the point where it will make sense for people to be able to print some things at home. But of course, there is value to mass printing, there is value to economies of scale. And so having something like a local pharmacy that's printing rather than having to distribute everything is the much more likely scenario in the short term. It's the much more likely scenario in the medium term. Specialized pharmaceuticals, things like that, if it's going to cost a lot, if it's going to be expensive machinery, yeah, it's going to happen there. At the same time, we have to recognize there's a lot of illicit and other types of chemicals and compounds that people are going to print at home. And given that that's going to happen, we have to create some sort of system that creates some protections for the individuals who are tinkering at home, who are doing the printing at home as well. But I agree, I'm going to go to the pharmacy to get my medicine for a long time to come. I'm not going to be printing it at home. Okay.
Another question. Yeah.
Kelly Charles from University of Sydney and one of the young scientists. I'm actually a pharmacologist, so we deal with this. I make drugs all the time. One of our major issues is medical literacy. Many patients or people in the community actually don't even have full, school education, let alone understand the information they're being given about their medication. So it's a huge leap of faith to be able to think that we're going to give you a 3D prescription, you're going to have a printer at home, and you're not going to know what to do with it. Most people probably can't even deal with their own microwave, or if it broke down, what to do. But they also don't read their information. As I was saying earlier, 50% of people actually don't read the information that comes with their drugs or follow the instructions properly.
Right.
So that's a massive issue in terms of safety.
Right.
So I don't see how we can go to that individual level until we bring the community up to a level where they can actually understand what they're trying to do with that medication. It's very different than food or CDs or music. This is something that can actually kill you. And there is 5-10% of patients who actually die from their medications by following it even properly.
Anyone want to respond to that?
I wholeheartedly agree. It's complex and it has specific and really considerable dangers. And yet, in spite of the illiteracy of the average consumer, drugs and other devices are starting to be marketed directly to consumers, and they're starting to be able to create them themselves. And so I think what we have to do is, instead of saying, look, this is all way over the head of the consumer, and we need to make sure we kind of preserve our traditional model of delivery of healthcare and delivery of medicine, is to recognize it is going direct to the consumer now. We have to figure out a better system of literacy of the consumer to enable them, given that all of these technologies, devices, and drugs are at their doorstep, to be able to do something about it.
Question at the back there.
Nita, you made the point that we need to figure out a system to manage this. Can you put some detail around that? Would there be licensing to buy a printer in the same way that people have to have a license to drive a car and need to take a road test and all of that? Is there some kind of educational scheme that would need to be enforced?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had all the answers for you, but I'll give you a couple of just thoughts on it. You know, every answer that I come up with, I think of the exceptions to those answers and the problems to it as well. So yes, I mean, I think, you know, if we look, for example, in synthetic biology, one of the things that we're trying to do in synthetic biology is, at least for dangerous substances, to be able to track how they're being purchased, and so put a lot of the burden on the manufacturers of the sale of those types of things to make sure that the people who are purchasing them are authorized and appropriate users. I think the same types of things right now, we're not at the point where people are building the raw materials at home. They're actually compounding from multiple different sources. And so you can trace and track and license and kind of precisely regulate for narcotics, for other types of illicit materials, the materials themselves, and you can put a lot of the burden on the manufacturers. Likewise, for the types of machineries that would enable people to do the 3D printing of some of these types of things, you can make sure that authorized users get them and not everybody gets them. To sell the materials-based 3D printers, you could figure out who was selling those things and you could put regulations in place for them. Eventually, that won't work. Because, you know, as in synthetic biology, when people can actually build from the ground up rather than having to buy the, you know, kind of pieces of the raw materials that they can build on top of, then you're able to circumvent it. But in the short term, that's a solution. And in the long term, we have to figure out something else.
I mean, the technology exists today to make everything we buy uniquely traceable. And so it's a matter of being able to put in the legislation to have the penalties and enforcement in place so that once illicit activity is detected, it can be acted upon. The other thing to keep in mind is if there were some peer rating systems such that you buy your reagents from a shop and you could rate based on the outcomes, and they could basically also rate you as a customer, similar to what the sharing economy seems to do. That could help take out some of the mistrust that seems to be a roadblock for adoption today.
And that indeed is how some illicit markets work already, isn't it?
That's right.
On the dark web and so on.
Yeah.
I think there's a question over there.
Yeah, one comment and one question. I think we need to differentiate between having 6 billion pharmacists in the world and having the drug just in time when a patient needs it. And you know, I work in technology. We're miniaturizing spectrometers, so there will be a way to control the quality of what you produce at home, as there will be a way to produce it at home. Right. My question is on a slightly different aspect. Is I deal with the FDA, CFDA on a regular basis, and we are 15 years behind where we are today. And here we're talking about going 10 years ahead. So next month will be eventually 25 years behind in terms of regulation. So just wanted to get your perspective on it, because I do think that where disruptive innovation needs to happen is on the regulators. Otherwise, we'll be done.
So can they catch up?
So regulation can't keep up with emerging technologies, and we have to rethink the way that we're doing regulation of emerging technologies. One of the areas that people who are more knowledgeable than I am in this area are really focusing on is a system of adaptive regulation rather than the kind of fixed regulations that have been traditionally put into place. And the FDA was built on a very antiquated model of healthcare development and drug development and device development. And personalized medicine and drug development that's much more targeted and personalized. It doesn't make any sense to be doing large-scale clinical trials that are about a drug that is applicable across an industry, across a huge swath of people. Personalized medicine and personalized genomics doesn't make sense to even think about large-scale clinical trials. Those were designed for an era before personalized medicine. And so the FDA recognizes this, and yet they're a little bit stuck with the model that they have. One thing that's interesting about 3D printing is that it's more like compounding, and the FDA doesn't traditionally regulate compounding, and that's different than drug development. And so it's this strange kind of exception that is this little loophole right now that the FDA is struggling with as well, but everybody essentially at home who are 3D printers are compounders rather than actually being drug developers. And so I think the short answer is we need to change our system of regulation. We need an adaptive system of regulation, not just for 3D printing, but for all emerging technologies. And the long answer is in the short run, we're going to have some interesting challenges to FDA's attempt to regulate in this area, given the kind of question mark about what the individual printer at home with their drugs is actually doing.
Sangyu, did you want to come in on this?
No, in general, I mean, we had great
Yeah.
comments and questions from the floor, but if I just, merge everything together, what I still want to say is that even though it's funny that I'm the one who can make all these things, but I'm the one who is most against it, I think, in this room. But it doesn't matter. One, for example, business proposal I can make to these members in this room is, for example, instead of installing 3D printer in every home, why don't one of you just create a startup company who do lots of 3D printing with the FDA discussion, so make it much more safe while delivering these drugs to the addicted people who need. I mean, that can be one possible solution. We talked about the precursor and reagent control as a one way of controlling this. No, it's not possible. That one you can have glucose, which can be obtained from either rice, for example. You can brew microorganisms to make any precursor you want. I'm sorry, but I'm one of them who do that. Mm-hmm. So, for example, you can make a very bad drug called 4-hydroxybutyric acid. It's a basically short-term memory loss drug, which is used for very wrong purposes during the date, for example. So that can be made from glucose directly. So you microbrew, you produce 4-hydroxybutyric acid, you can further convert it. We talked about the yeast producing morphine. Bingo, here's heroin, now I'm rich. Oops, you are rich in jail probably, right? But nonetheless, you can do all these things. So still, I think we need some time to set up the safe and secure way of regulating this. And one proposition, as I said, is maybe we can have one company doing all this under regulation.
On regulation, there might actually be an interesting notes to take from the Eastern medicine example, because as you describe it, it's basically compounding. Right. And so this is compounding of Western medicines, and if there are regulations that address compounding of Eastern medicines, that might be a good starting point to address the issues.
Right.
There's a question over here on the right, if we could get a mic over here.
You have a question in the back after that, too.
Sorry?
You have one over there.
Okay.
Too, so.
And then if we could get the other mic over there, that would be great. Yeah, just over there. Great, go.
Great. So my name is Andrew Thompson. I'm the chief executive of a company called Proteus Digital Health. We're a digital medicines company. I'll confess I had my first conversation about printing drugs with Sir Richard Sykes, who was just retired from GSK as the CEO in 2008. And his time estimate on this was, he said to me, young man, that won't happen for 1,000,000 billion years. So he had a pretty clear opinion on it. What I wonder about here is that you've started and looked at the most extreme end of this, which is very dangerous, things like heroin, and then you've explored things in the middle around consumers, where I'd say to you, look, the big challenge here is that if you look at how consumers use their drugs, less than 25% of consumers today use prescription drugs properly. So there's a huge gap here before people start printing their own. Why don't we think about, and I'd be interested in your reaction to this, printing at home things that are intrinsically safe, like vitamin tablets, because that would be a way to start to build out a supply chain and a process that would support the kinds of things you're talking about and would allow us to, what I'm going to call, engineer the evolutions in human society that are necessary for these things to happen. Because I observed today that there's two camps: people who believe that everything can be solved with technology or software, or people who believe that everything can be solved with regulation. And neither of those are enough, right? And actually, the two of them together aren't enough. We have to, in this sort of fourth industrial revolution, think about evolution of human society and how we build processes that enable that gap to be filled.
We're going to take this point, and then we'll come back to the panel to wrap up. So,
yes, yeah. Mike, I have a question. I'm Kyoshi Matsuda from Mitsubishi Chemical based in Tokyo. The question is, from the capacity of the 3D printing and in the context of this, discussions, the same thing would happen in the area of medical device? That's my question.
So could you print medical devices as well?
I'm going to take that.
Yeah, okay,
Why
take
not
that
print
one
vitamins?
first, yeah.
why would the consumer want to print vitamins is what I would say. So I hear you on the, wouldn't it be great if they started there and then we could actually figure it out? But the question you have to ask is, why would the individual consumer want to print a drug at home at all? Why would they bother as opposed to going into a pharmacy and buying a drug? And for the most part right now, it'll be either that it's illegal, so they can't get access to the drug, and so they want to print it at home. It's inconvenient, or it's too expensive, and somehow if it was cheaper, easier, or simply possible, they'd get it at home. The promise in the short term of 3D printing of drugs is personalization and customization, and then there's all of the illicit side of things. But the personalization and the customization means you can make a dose that's specific to you. You can make a solution, like an unstable solution that would have to be taken quickly at home for you. You can make a dissolvable tablet that otherwise wouldn't be stable to be able to ship and create it at home. And so the initial uses are probably not vitamins, which are readily and cheaply available to most people. It's probably that they're going to create the things that are otherwise not easily accessible from a pharmacy. And if that's the case, if those are the types of things that people are going to try to print first, or that there's a market for printing first, like it or not, those are the things that will be printed. And so I think we have to think about this as it's going to happen. It's going to happen in spaces where it first makes sense economically, or it first makes sense for other logistic reasons. And then we'll see whether or not it makes any sense given the cost of printing at home, given the kind of complexities of printing at home, whether people will go to the next step. I think it'll be a kind of tinkering tool in the beginning, and eventually it'll go to something where if it makes sense on a broader scale, they'll start to do it at home.
Yeah. For medical devices, the economics may not check out because if you buy this expensive printer, you're going to be cranking out so many medical devices that are customized for various people that it may actually not make sense. You may have a special condition that necessitates 20 different medical devices to be made every month. But it may actually be more plausible to have it almost like a regional.
But what about, for example, contact lenses or something like that?
That potentially could be an interesting application. But then again, there are not enough contact lenses purchased by an individual
to make it worthwhile.
To make it worthwhile.
Yeah.
Even if you look at a good example is coffee. We still don't all make our own coffee. Neither do we all know how to use our coffee makers really well.
We've got just a couple of minutes left, so in the name of finishing on time, let's just sort of sum up where we think we've got to, and particularly that question of how we might resolve some of these tensions. What are the processes? What do we need to do as a society, bringing in the technologists, the scientists, but also business and civil society in order to think this through?
So I can start, I guess. So technology will always advance, but without proper ethics and safety security issues considered, it's obsolete, and we shouldn't do it. Now, as we talked over an hour on this issue, I think 3D printing is a great technology, but yet there are a lot of things to be clarified before we actually adopt it. So I already suggested one potential solution of having authorized company dedicated for 3D printing of personalized pills or whatever. So that might be one solution. And thus, still we want to be careful, but technology is advancing enough to print or brew all these chemicals. That's what my message will be.
I think if we proactively find a positive application of the technology that society buys in, and society actually helps defend the technology from falling into bad hands. And so that might be a good way to proactively address it. I don't know what the application specifically is, but if we all really enjoy 3D printers, and because criminal activities put in the benefit we get as non-criminals in danger, we could, as society, try to push that out. So that might be a...
So utility is the way
right.
forward. Yeah, and Nita, final
I'd say
thought.
I'm agnostic on the technology. I simply recognize the inevitability of it. And in light of that, I think that the right next steps for us as a society are to try to develop the safeguards that enable people who are going to be doing 3D printing at home to be able to do so in ways that give them safety checks, that give them some assurances, that give them some ways to protect themselves against some of the inevitable consequences and risks that arise from that kind of technology.
So we shouldn't be thinking about what ought to happen, but what is going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Great. Good place to finish. Thank you for some great questions, great panel, really interesting discussion. Thank you very much.